Our next presenter is Scott McFarlane. Scott is currently the wildlife manager for Deseret Land and Livestock, a 230,000 acre ranch based near Woodruff, Utah. Previously, Scott worked for the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources for 36 years in various capacities, including law enforcement, big game biology, and as private lands public wildlife coordinator. With over 40 years of experience making wildlife an asset to private land farming and ranching operations, we could think of no one better to discuss managing public resources on private lands. Scott is joining us from his office in Woodruff. It's all yours, Scott.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, Scott. We got your slides up.
Thank you. I appreciate the privilege of speaking to such a diverse group here. And I've, by way of introduction, I have worked as a private lands manager, and I worked in Utah as my home state. And I worked in probably the largest private land area in the northern part of the state. And as I was listening to some of these presentations, I was taken back a little bit from the first presentation saying that Texas was 90-something% private lands. As you go into the western states, I think it's just the inverse of that, that there's mostly public lands as opposed to private lands. And so I hope by my presentation here, I can bring a little bit different perspective to the issue of managing of public resources on private land. And so I'll go on to my next slide here. Years ago, and this has been quite a few years ago, when newspapers were made out of paper, and I was going through a commentary. I found this political cartoon basically, and I was going to use this to introduce the subject of private lands versus public wildlife. I couldn't find the cartoon that I clipped out, but I had a colleague of mine draw me a picture of what I could remember from it. I don't remember the caption on it, but it's basically showing a hunter that's harvested a deer either on private property or it came off of public property onto private property, and it's showing basically that this is how he feels, is it's basically out of reach for him. And this is the dilemma of having a public resource that belongs to the public that resides on private properties. So I guess maybe the caption on this would be that maybe the grass is greener on the other side, and it's viewed that way oftentimes. So let's see if I can there. So I kind of wanted to have you look at this from several sides of the fence. On one side of the fence, you have the public hunter that is looking, and all he can see is private property signs: no trespassing, don't fish, don't shoot, don't hike. You know, you'll be prosecuted if you go on the property. And judging by the bullet holes in the sign here, I can imagine the feelings of the people that are looking at the sign who can't go onto the property. So looking at the other side of the fence, you have the private landowner who harbors and feeds, and it's his backyard. He has the wildlife on his property, and he has to view it as either going to be an asset or a liability to him. And in a lot of cases, the wildlife is a liability to him, because it's either eating crops that are being grown that are meant for livestock in the wintertime, or they're eating prepared crops in the wintertime that are being stored for feeding livestock in the wintertime. And then you have probably another side of the fence that's maybe not a side of the fence, but looking from above there, you've got a state wildlife agency that says, hey, we've got a wildlife resource that lives on private lands, that lives on public lands. And we're charged with managing that resource and how do we allocate that resource out to the public, being the public resource. But you also have to look at the private landowner as part of the public also. So I just want to go into some conceptual things to begin with. And there's the public trust doctrine that basically says that wildlife is a public resource. It's held in public trust, and that inhabits both public land, and that inhabits both public and private land. And so, and I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but we have, and I'm sure most people have heard of or are fairly familiar with the North American model of wildlife conservation. And it has, there's 7 principles that has to deal with this. And the first one is being that the wildlife is a public resource, independent of land ownership, and it is managed by government agencies. There's other things, you know, this it had its origins, I think, clear in the 19th century, where when wildlife populations were diminishing at alarming rates, there were species of animals that were, because of market hunting, that had become extinct or on the verge of becoming extinct. And I was reading that the white-tailed deer at some point almost was extirpated from North America. And that's hard to believe with looking at wildlife or white-tailed deer populations now, but there's the bison, there's several species that were on the verge of extinction because of market hunting and uncontrolled hunting on the lands. So another thing is that the allocation of wildlife will be allocated by law. It's a public resource, and it is going to be managed by the government. Another part of it is, and I won't go through all of those, but it'll be used for a wise use, and it's an international resource, and science is the way that using sound science principles is the way that the wildlife will be managed. So looking at this, if we kind of look at how things how our country was settled in a east-west expansion, when our country was settled, it was most in the best habitats were taken up by, we were basically an agricultural society. So most of the best habitats, whether by purchase or by homesteading, you know, were taken up and used for agriculture. So the agricultural lands had usually the best water, the best topography, and the best feeds that were on it. And so basically our better lands are usually taken up in private ownership. And many of these species rely on these critical habitats found on these private lands. Some states, and I apologize if I keep referring back to Utah, it's my home state where I have the majority of my experience, but in some states, and Utah is not alone in this, that the majority of the big game winter ranges are on private lands and managed by the private landowners. So as we've taken these private lands and they have become developed, they've you know, a lot of the lands have been sold for other uses, for housing developments, for other uses than are compatible with livestock or agriculture. That our habitat has been lost, and access at the same time to private land and access to public lands through private lands have also diminished at the same time. So Aldo Leopold, who was a great conservationist, he was a forester and he was an ecologist also. Early on, and he had a set of papers that he published, I think it was in the mid-1930s. He stated that this is the geography of conservation is such that most of the best land will always be privately held. And I think that was some pretty good foresight on his part to be perceptive to realize that was going to happen, and that it basically is the case right now. So as I've gone through, and I've been able to watch the progression of states and their programs and things over the years. And one of the things that I've noticed that has happened that changes programs with different states is that as the populations has grown in these states, the demand for the resource eventually outgrows the resource availability. So I guess what that means is that, years ago, it wasn't that big of a concern. There were unlimited hunting permits in states, and now you don't see that is the case anymore. The demand on most states, and if it hasn't happened yet in some of these Western states, it will happen. The demand on the resource will eventually outgrow the resource availability. And it usually at the same time, the public is usually calling for a higher quality of the resource. It used to be that the hunters and the fishermen and the outdoor users were just happy to have a piece of meat to put in the freezer, and they actually depended on that. Now it isn't something they depend on. They value to have, something, they value having the meat part of it, but there's been a higher emphasis on the trophy quality of these animals. So that's one of the things that comes with when the demand outgrows the resource availability. And what most state agencies have in common when this happens, and like I say, it will happen, is they look for new ways to allocate the public resource among the users of the resource. So what happens, they have to look for new ways they restrict permit numbers is usually the first thing that happens. They split seasons, they have multiple weapons seasons, they have limited entry hunts that are designed to promote quality. All of this usually puts a little bit heavier burden on the resource. It happens, but one of the things they look at the very end of that, and because there's so much wildlife that is on the private lands, is they look at programs to access the public wildlife on these private lands. The culture in the Western states is that it's been that they've had almost unlimited access years ago, and as that access has diminished, people have been used to getting it for free. Now they look at it that maybe it's a program where they have to pay for, and there's a little bit of resistance to that. So like I said, I've been able to, through the course of my career, I've been able to help develop and administer public lands programs designed to do this very thing, that to facilitate the access and the harvest of a public resource on private lands. And there's several things that I just wanted to make to note that were pretty important for these programs. And the first one being that wildlife is a public resource, as I talked about before, and the programs must include a public benefit. I believe in the first presentation by Dave Delaney, he did say that they do include a public benefit, even on a primarily private land state, with using the public, making sure there's a public benefit on that ranch, on the King Ranch. So that is it's such an important thing, especially on these lands that have the public land states that are predominantly public lands. The public does feel that wildlife does belong to them, and it does. And it's like I say, it's a thing where the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And the next thing is that it should be designed to reward landowners that serve the public interest in creating, maintaining, and preserving habitat. Without that, if there's no reward, there's no incentive for a landowner to create, maintain, or preserve habitat that is there. There has to be that incentive there. It should create wildlife as an asset, not a liability to the owners of the habitat. They're always going to have wildlife on the properties. If they manage the properties properly, there will have wildlife on there, and there has to be it has to be an asset, and usually that has to be a financial asset to the owners of the property. And lastly, we need to provide an incentive for the landowners to adjust ranching and farming practices enough to provide a quality habitat and enhance wildlife populations, and to allow for public use. And that last thing, to allow for public use, is a very, very difficult thing, because landowners view their property as their backyard, and it is very hard for them to invite the public into their backyard and use it without a proper incentive to do that. So I made a list of some things that were some challenges on managed public resource on private lands. And the first thing is that when we're good stewards of the land, when we manage these very good habitats, we take care of the land, the farms and ranches are going to attract wildlife. That's just something that comes with it. If you create a good habitat, the wildlife naturally will come. The thing is that it does cost money to manage wildlife. The bigger the piece of property, the more it costs to manage the wildlife generally. Whether you do habitat projects on there for cattle, for livestock on the land, or whatever you do, it does cost money to manage the wildlife. And the bigger the program, the more money it costs to manage that. So I kind of went through and I lined out 3 concerns that I could come up with, and I'm sure there's many, many more, about having wildlife populations on farms and ranches. And there's basically 3 issues I could come up with. In most cases, that there is a loss of revenue when you're sharing land with big game populations. Whether it be because they're competing for range resources, with your livestock on the rangeland, or whether they're competing with, if you're growing crops and of hay that, the wildlife is going to naturally be attracted to, and there's a loss in the crops, whatever, there's going to be a loss of revenue of sharing land, especially with big game populations. So there's usually a destruction of property holdings by wildlife, whether it be fences or there usually comes, and I have to speak from my experience, we've got a sizable elk herd on the Deseret Ranch here, and it is incredible amount of damage that they could do to the fences that are done on the pasture fences. We've got a little over 100 pastures on here, and there's quite a bit of destruction that goes on by the elk, or careless users of the resource, whether they leave gates open and mix cattle where they shouldn't be mixed, or they drive on roads when they're wet and they shouldn't be there, or cut fences, or whatever they do. Sometimes there's careless users of the resource that can cause an economic impact to it. And probably the last one is everybody wants to use it for free. It seems like in some of the Western states, and that it has been available to them for free for so long that that's what they expect. And there's actually a culture of people that say that, it's our wildlife and we're going to go get it regardless whether it's private or public property. But they do want to use it for free. So I just wanted to go through a little bit what we do and how we manage the wildlife resource on the Deseret Land and Livestock Ranch. The Deseret Land and Livestock Ranch, as he said in the introduction, is about a 230,000 acre privately owned ranch. There is a little bit of BLM property within the boundaries of it, but it's primarily private lands. We have entered into a private lands program with the state of Utah. It's called the Cooperative Wildlife Management Unit Program, or in short, the CWMU. And basically what I'll just go over briefly what the program does for us, but for the ranch, it's considered its own hunting unit within the state of Utah. It has, with the tags that are allocated for this, are specifically for the ranch. They're not good off of the ranch at all. And so we sit down with the biologists and the state biologist, and we come up with a harvest number, based on population, yearly population models and counts. And we determine how many animals that are going to be removed from the ranch. And out of that allocation, a certain percentage of those go to the public. And then the other portion go as private permits that can be sold or allocated to anybody that legally can possess a permit. So what we have is basically guaranteed permits every year. We host what in exchange for this, what the ranch gets is the guaranteed permits, but we also get extended seasons so that we can accommodate the number of hunters that are hunting on the ranch. So just for an example of how many hunters that we do host on the ranch, but we host approximately 370 public hunters annually. That's with free access. We do have other programs where they can choose to hire a guide if they want, but basically that's a free access. It costs them nothing except for buying the state permit, and all the permits are done through a public drawing. There's no open permit system on this. So, and in contrast, that 370 permits though is antlered and antlerless permits. So, and then in contrast, the ranch gets about 240 permits, there are antlerless permits in there also, but they're primarily the buck permits, buck or bull permits. So in the name of this program, it's called the Cooperative Wildlife Management Unit. It is a program where we do cooperate with the State Wildlife Agency on unit management goals. The way that the state manages populations is through the antlerless harvest, and basically with few exceptions, the public gets most of the antlerless harvest on there. They do get buck and bull permits also, but the majority of the antlerless permits are allocated out to public hunters. What this does, what this program does for the ranch, it allows us, because we do derive an income from it, to work on habitat improvements annually. This is something we are constantly working on the ranch to improve habitats. We use grazing as a tool to enhance the habitat for both livestock and wildlife. We've got grazing, we graze the cattle on some portions of the ranch, but there's some portion of the ranch that it doesn't make sense to graze cattle. It's too steep or rough a country, but we do graze those with sheep that are not owned by us, but we lease the sheep grazing out on parts of that to create a different kind of habitat that we prefer to have on the mountain. So what the wildlife income does allow us to do is adjust stocking rates to accommodate big game. There is a dietary overlap, and particularly with elk, with cattle and elk, and so we have to adjust to that, so we don't overstock the ranges. So another consequence, or one of the benefits, is that we do provide high quality wildlife for the ranch and our surrounding properties. There's always going to be spillover. There's an excess of wildlife that comes off of the ranch, and the public and private properties surrounding the ranch derive a direct benefit from that. It allows us to maintain a high quality habitat for both livestock and wildlife. And we do have on the ranch a limited watchable wildlife program. We've got somewhere around 273 bird species that inhabit the ranch, and we do have a watchable wildlife, and that is done through a lease. We value all species of wildlife on the ranch, and what this program actually does for us, it allows the ranch to be profitable on almost every year. We've talked about the volatility and instability of the livestock markets. It doesn't, the the wildlife program doesn't have quite that much of the instability, but it's more of a stable income, and in a lot of cases allows the ranch to be profitable. Not that the cattle aren't profitable, but some years they may not be. So kind of in summing up a lot of this, there's a couple principles that I wanted to hit on. And one thing is the agriculture that is not profitable is not sustainable. I had some people that I worked with that had a cattle and sheep operation. They had quite a large land holding. And I was talking to the owner of that operation at the end of the year. He said, when we sat down and paid all the bills and figured out what our expenses were versus what our income was, he says, this year we made $14 off of our ranching operation. He says, had we had not been in the wildlife program through the Cooperative Wildlife Management Unit program and had an income from the wildlife portion of it, so in several years, I'm pretty sure that we would be forced to sell our property to another use. And which brings me into the next thing. It says that if agricultural lands don't produce comparable or competitive revenue, chances are they will be converted to land uses not compatible for wildlife or agriculture. I think when that happens, everybody loses. It's to everybody's benefit to preserve these ranches, to preserve open space, and be able to have these things for our generation and for future generations also. So what they said that they would have to sell it to is they would sell all of their crop lands that would go into houses, and their mountain lands, their grazing pastures would be sold for summer home subdivisions like that. So not really a use that's compatible with wildlife or agriculture. And I guess lastly that I look at wildlife, there's kind of a misconception among a lot of the wildlife groups, particularly, that wildlife and livestock are not compatible. They absolutely are. And when they are managed correctly, they're better together when they're alone. In the last presentation, they're talking about people buying properties for recreation uses, for things that are other than livestock. Well, I had some people that lived by me that bought a mountain. It was about a 35,000 acre purchase, and it was a mountain. It had pretty good wildlife populations on it. And they were very, very well intended. They wanted to leave it all for wildlife. They wanted to hunt it. They wanted to use it for viewing opportunities. They wanted it to be basically a wildlife haven. They weren't worried about the income impacts of the property. And in the first few years, after they took the livestock off, there was a net decrease in the number of wildlife. It was very noticeable to them. It was noticeable to the neighbors. They did have a decrease in it. So what they did is they said, well, we'll feed the wildlife. We'll try and increase our production capability by feeding the wildlife. Well, that didn't work, and it wasn't until they hired somebody that created a grazing plan for them with wildlife in mind on that. They started to see the increases in the big game populations, particularly on the ranch, and so. It just shows that wildlife and livestock are compatible. On the Deseret Land Livestock Ranch here, we have been able to show that they work together. They work together well, and when they're managed properly. And kind of in conclusion, here, I just wanted to close with a statement here that. And this is by Aldo Leopold. And as I said, he was a great conservationist. He was a forester. He was he had a lot of foresight in the things that I think were going to happen in the future. But his statement is that conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. We've got a lot of programs that are designed, we've got greenbelt programs, and I'm not sure what it's called in other states, where it reduces the taxes to be able to preserve and open land spaces and keep them into the agricultural interests. But if we don't reward our private landowners who conserve this public interest, that maintain and they grow and they preserve wildlife habitats in the public interest, I think everybody is going to lose in the end. And I have to give a lot of credit to some very forward-thinking people in the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources years ago that could see the trend that was happening, that family farms and things were being sold at an alarming rate because they couldn't make it in the livestock business or the agricultural business. So they sold the lands to be used in the next best thing, which was usually development. And so they created these programs, and it has been a very, very successful program. And it hasn't come without problems, but it's been a successful program in accomplishing that goal and keeping the private landowners and keeping the lands in private ownership to do that. So with that, I know I'm a little bit short on my presentation here, but with that, I appreciate the opportunity to speak and address the group. And with that, thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. Appreciate you taking time to visit with us. We've got one good question, and it's kind of lengthy, so let me just kind of give you a heads up. I think this has to do with potential conflict between large and small acreage landowning neighbors. And so the question is, what would you suggest based on your experience to balance the local relationship between a large landowner that profits off wildlife when the smaller neighbor may have the wildlife population spending the summer or winter on them, but then the wildlife migrates back to the large property owner, leaving the small landowner no opportunity to participate or profit from it. And I know you spoke to that a little bit when you said DL&L, some of the livestock some of the wildlife does leave DL&L and benefits neighbors. So from your experience, what would you have to offer there?
Well, that's a really good question. It's something that we have to constantly deal with, because you have like upstream landowners that are usually big landowners, and downstream landowners that usually have the wildlife at a time of the year where they can't be hunted. And what we've done with these programs basically is they've tried to incorporate them we've encouraged people to incorporate these properties where possible, into their management units, so that they could capitalize and benefit from the permits that are there. Sometimes there's enough space in between them that's not possible, and a lot of times they've contributed in wildlife habitat projects that benefited their wildlife and the livestock. And that's a hard one to deal with, and then there's been times where the landowners have actually offered tags for sale or giving them to the downstream landowners just to compensate them for having that wildlife on their properties at different times of the year. I lost my train of thought. I had another thing that they've done, but there's a lot of things that can be done, and that always is going to be a problem, that some of the surrounding landowners do not benefit as much from the wildlife as the bigger landowners that harbor a lot of the game also.
Yeah, great idea. Several of the previous speakers have talked with a heavy emphasis on Texas about the interest in hunting opportunities, and I'd like for you to characterize, maybe just pick the 3 or 4 most important species to include maybe deer, elk, birds, and maybe predators, and talk about the interest in the public land states in the West, the interest amongst hunters for those opportunities. Are you seeing a growing interest in those major species? Is it kind of plateaued? Some gaining interest, some losing? What do you see in the West?
Well, what I'm seeing, and on the ranch, on the Deseret Ranch, we have what we do hunt. We hunt deer, elk, moose, and pronghorn for the big game species. And what I have seen is that there's an increasing interest for particularly mule deer. Um, there's always been an interest for the elk, but it seems to be that's kind of plateaued. But there's always been an increasing interest on the mule deer thing. Mule deer is probably a good trophy size quality mule deer is one of the hardest things that I think that we have to grow. Mule deer have such a specialized diet, and they're just a lot harder to manage and grow. One of the things that we deal with probably in the northern part and some of these other states is we deal with harsh winters that give us, some pretty hard setbacks on our deer populations. It usually doesn't affect the elk quite as much as it does mule deer. And so mule deer is probably, the demand is always going to be there for that. And if anything, it has increased more over the last 10 years than anything else. So did I answer the question there?
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that characterizes it well. Just another question, and please, I preface this with the statement that I'm not wanting to venture into partisan politics at all, but for those of us that aren't familiar with public land policy, how much does what's going on in Washington in terms of change of leadership, or maybe even absent of change of leadership, how much does Washington influence public land policy from the standpoint of wildlife management and harvest?
It doesn't a whole lot, I don't think, not on the state level so much. Public policy probably has more of an impact on the federal level than it does on the state level. The federal government has given the states basically the autonomy to manage, without federal intervention, to manage, except for migratory species, to manage the state wildlife species is best for each state. So sometimes when you change governors or things like that, that it interjects a little bit of politics into the wildlife management aspect of it. But other than that, I don't think I can't see a big change in it. So.
Yeah, good, thank you. We do have another question. Do you see much interest in small game hunting and or fishing?
Yes, there is. We do have a fishing program on the ranch here, but it's incorporated. We have one general lease for the entire ranch, and it's incorporated into that. But one of the things that a lot of the private landowners that have the resource to do that have capitalized on the fishing, because fishing is a very big thing in the western states here, and I imagine it is all over the United States, but it is definitely a resource to capitalize on. And if the lands do have the resource, it is a great income potential, has a great income potential. The bird hunting, the state of Utah has a program. It's called the commercial hunting area, where they can, where private landowners do have the ability to release birds and have a commercial hunting operation on there. And that's not a real big program in Utah, but it is something that some of the landowners do capitalize on, and that's for bird hunting. So there's probably an income opportunity for just about any species that there has, on some of our ranches in Montana and Wyoming. Some of the income potential comes from prairie dog hunting. We spend a lot of money every year trying to control prairie dogs, and the hunting thing just kind of supplements that anyway. So, but there's an income potential on a lot of things, a lot of the wildlife species.
Yeah, that's great to know. Great to know. I want to do in the time we got just a couple of minutes left, Scott. I would ask you to back up to your third to the last slide, if you would. I think there's 2 points on there that deserve re-emphasis for this audience, because they're in contrast to maybe public opinion regarding some of those things. So yeah. Go forward a couple of slides. One more, I think.
Okay, how about, is it this one?
Yeah, it's this one. To me, though, that second and third bullet point deserve reemphasis. The fact that wildlife and livestock are compatible, and I really like what you said, that they're better together than alone when managed properly. Because I think we hear a lot and we read a lot about, livestock are detrimental to the West and they're detrimental to ranges in the Great Plains, and they absolutely need to leave and be gone. But I think your point is well made, and the great stockmen and biologists agree that those two are good. They are compatible and they can be beneficial from each other. But then the second point is the one that really, as I was previewing your slides, I thought was just really, really a good comment. And that is your comment that if agricultural lands don't produce compatible or competitive revenue, in other words, if they're not sustainable, chances are they're going to be converted to land uses not compatible for either wildlife or agriculture. And I really liked your point in that was, when we go there, that's not a place that really any of us benefit from.
Well, usually when that happens, usually the only one that benefits from that is a developer. So that's hard to say, but there's a lot of truth to it too. So
yeah, there is a lot of truth, and certainly, again, not being that familiar with the West, but the I-35, the I-45 corridor in Texas are great examples of, when real estate values get to the point that agriculture can't be sustainable, then it typically goes the way that you just described of the developer. So with that, Scott, thank you so very much for your time, for putting together this excellent presentation. We appreciate you joining us. And with that, we'll transition to the next speaker. Thanks, Scott.